Old English you have to read like a foreign language with a dictionary and just kind of it's much more foreign. It's absolutely much more foreign. So interestingly, the difference between Old English and Middle English seems to be much bigger than the difference between Middle English and present-day English. So if you were somehow airdropped into the Middle English, like 1300s, 14th century London, when Middle English was spoken, you would be able, after 2 weeks, to feel relatively comfortable, because it seems like this is not much different than another dialect of English would be. Of course, there are structural differences, lexical differences, phonological differences, phonetic differences, semantic differences, all of those, of course. But compared to if you were airdropped in the Anglo-Saxon England, in the middle of Old English, that would take a much longer period of time to become fluent and conversant with the Beowulf poet, for instance. So changes have taken place, and we indicate the beginning of the Middle English from 1100 and lasting to 1500. And of course, as I mentioned before, it's not that people go to bed in one day in 1100 and are speakers of Old English, and in the morning they wake up and they're speakers of Middle English. The change was extremely small. Slow. But 1100, for the purposes of understanding what has happened in the structure of the language, in the lexicon of the language, and so on, it makes sense to draw the line somewhere here. Because if you compare the English on an average spoken between 1100 and 1500 versus English spoken before the Norman Conquest, 1066, Old English, you will see that there are huge differences between those two varieties of English. So we are looking at the diachrony of the language, how the language has developed. And I thought we would start with just by a quick comparison of the Lord's Prayer, which people who are watching, who can be watching this, they can find it here. They can probably blow it up a little bit. But anyway, here's also a handout, so I might also try to post this in a little bit bigger form. So what you have on top, you have the Lord's Prayer in Old English first, and then in Middle English. So let's practice the Old English, because that's going to be coming up, and then we'll read it in Middle English. So let's read the Old English version first, and while we read these, try to focus on the kinds of things that have changed. So, Fader ore, Thuthe ert on heavenum, Sithin nama, Jehalhod, Tobekume thin riche, Jewurde thin willa, on eardan, swa, on heavenum, urne jedaiquam liikan hlaaf. There's our favorite adjective. Jedaiquam liikan. Hlaaf. Syle uus todai. And for youth uus urne gultas. Swa we for youvat. Urum gultendum. Gultendum. Here's where we have the gultendum.
Yeah.
Gultendum. It's like an E, but rounded lips. Gultendum. And nejelad. Thuus on kostnunge. Ak alys. Us of uvele. Sothliche. All right. So now the same in Middle English, and you'll notice that there have been substantial differences, changes that have taken place. And we're looking at a short text that is relatively familiar, and this will allow us to do a little bit of comparison. So we'll read this to Urfadir, that art in heavenes, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come to, be thy will done, in earth as in heaven. Give to us this day our bread over other substance, and forgive to us our debts, as we forgiven to our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. So, what has changed? Look at all the different areas of language. Look at the graphology. Let's start graphemes, the orthography. Let's look at what graphemes have changed between Old English and present day English. Okay. So, something has disappeared, something has been added.
All of the runes are mostly replaced.
All of the what?
All of the runic symbols, like there's no F.
Yeah.
F.
But they have added in Yale.
Yeah, and these are not necessarily, we don't necessarily see all the...
And the V's are like U's.
Yes, they are indicated with quite haphazardly, sometimes with a V and sometimes with a U.
Yeah.
And so the eth is still in both of these excerpts there, but little by little in Middle English, the thorn and the eth started to be written as we write it with th. It's not indicated in this, doesn't show that change yet. But if yes, it does show. Sorry, it does. I was looking at the IPA on the right hand column. The IPA doesn't, of course, show it because it shows either the or the interdental fricatives, the voiced and voiceless ones. But yeah, in the text, the th, true, it shows up. And then what else do you notice there? So the thorn and the eth are not written anymore in the orthography.
You have the E's on the ends of words are not pronounced. Like for R, like R, Fadia, in Old English it was Ura, so the
Yeah.
ending
Yes,
has been
yes. So the sound U is still the sound U in Middle English, but it's very often written with OU. Yeah.
You can see the changes that Grimm's Law shows with the, maybe not, I don't know, I'm reading wrong. The, like the G's and stuff. Never mind.
Which line is that?
I don't know. I got it wrong. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Grimm's Law it affected the language a little bit earlier during the Germanic times, so it had already affected the Old English text, and then it remains the same. Yes.
In the first line, it goes from Fada Ure to Our Father, so the word order has changed.
The word order has changed exactly. You put determiner first in Middle English. Yes. Anything else that you notice? Look at line 2. From thu the ert on heavenum to that art in heaveness.
So, yeah, preposition changed and...
Preposition has changed, and look at the word heaven. What has changed there?
Change the F to a D.
Yeah, so from the dative plural, heavenum, in Old English, dative is gone, dative plural is gone, and it's just what looks like our plural, heavens, in Middle English. Anything else?
The first letter on line 6 is new.
What line is that? The ash, yes.
Yes.
The ash has disappeared, and that was one of the writing orthographic changes that happened. Ash disappeared, and it kind of reflected the pronunciation change, because a became a in many words. That was one of those unconditional changes that you've probably been reading about. So fader became fadir, a became a, was became was. So it was interesting. Those changes, they just sometimes they take place and change everything. Unconditional changes don't have an explanation in the sound environment. They just happen throughout in all cases.
The ending on the word day changed.
The
So
words.
it's D-A-I instead of D-H-G.
Yeah.
On line
6.
6.
So give us this day.
Yes, exactly. That did change. Yes. In that we see the die becoming die, the a becoming a as well. Yeah.
Everywhere that in Old English there was like the letter G, I'm seeing the letter Y instead. In
Yes,
Middle English.
because the spelling started to reflect how things were actually said. Do you notice the long vowels, like in the Middle English one, kingdom, or double O? So no longer do you. It was kind of like an aid for people to know who didn't know how to pronounce this, and this is not. So that, and then in another place we have, I think, double E's.
There's a double T on line 7 with two ure dentus.
Yeah, that is, yes. And on line 6 you see bread.
Yeah.
So, somebody could write a paper on the kinds of changes that have happened, but let's look at the words now, because that was also a huge change. So what are you starting to see? What kinds of words are you starting to see replacing old Anglo-Saxon words in the Old English version of the poem or prayer?
Yeah, French, especially the datus, It's probably taken
It's from French. Betis is from French on line 7, I guess.
Yes.
What other French words do you spot there?
Temptation.
Temptation.
Tentation,
Substance.
substance, yes. And the last line,
Um,
deliver, yes.
oh yeah, delivery.
So you've got these additions from French, and it kind of, and of course, Sothlige has become Amen. It's borrowing from Hebrew. So Sothlige was a good old Anglo-Saxon, truly, but now it has been replaced. So in a sense, this language has become a little bit more international, but it has a different ring to it, and we can understand it much better, because you wouldn't even need a dictionary, Middle English dictionary, necessarily to figure this out. Once you know that, like for instance on line 6, give is written in a funky way from our point of view, and forgive the same thing. But once you figure that out, then it's easy.
Yeah. So the weird like 3-looking symbol, that's like how they would write the G's then?
Yes. This one. Very often used. The thing with Old English is, Middle English, is that it was not printed until when William Caxton brought the printing press to England and started printing. But there was a lot of dialect variation during Middle English times, and that means that there were a number of different ways of writing the same words. It was not a standardized orthography, so people pretty much wrote what they spoke in their dialects, but they also were under this huge French influence, because the people who wrote were more educated than people who didn't read and write, and there were plenty of those as well, the majority. So the people who wrote, they knew French also, most likely, and they were under the French writing influence, because French was that power language. So I just wanted to show this to you to kind of like give you a little bit of a taste of how Old English changed when we reached 1100, after the Norman Conquest. When the other handout that you picked up, and which I will post, is just like, points of interest, like a little bit of a summary, and then questions for review, and you can use that when you start studying the language. So I'm going to read this. Well, actually, let's talk about this a little bit. You've seen this before, but I just wanted to kind of remind us that what happened in 1066 was really a big deal for England, and England had basically, or Britannia, of course, it was occupied by the Romans first, inhabited by Celts before the Romans came for a long time, we don't know how long, but there were basically these 3 big important onslaughts of invasions to the island. The first one was when the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Frisians came from across the Baltic Sea and landed there on the eastern and southern parts of England. So that was the Germanic tribes coming in 449. And it was not really an invasion. They were invited to come as mercenaries to come and help, but they did come and they settled, and they are the beginning of the English language. As one of your questions was, the Angles gave the name to English, of course, and then we still have remnants of Saxons, for instance. Essex and Wessex in England are like East Saxon, West Saxon. That's where they come from. So that was a big onslaught. That was the beginning, kind of like the inception of the English language. And then we have these a little bit later, the Viking invasions coming from the north. And they kept coming for a couple of centuries, these were the 9th and 10th centuries, basically, were the big times of the Viking invasions, and we've already studied, you've read about that. And then now we have the third one, is the Norman invasion, or conquest, whatever you want to call it. And that was in 1066. So these are three. And now if we think about what kinds of people these Germanic tribes, Vikings, and the Normans were, ethnically they were all Germanic, but linguistically there was a difference. A huge difference between the Normans and the other ones. So, of course, Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, they were speakers of West Germanic dialects, their own dialects, which probably were mutually intelligible. So they were West Germanic. Then we have the Vikings, the Norse people, and that is not West Germanic, it is it's Germanic, but what kind of Germanic? North Germanic, yes. They brought the North Germanic influence to England, and I think there's a nice map in your book which shows that even today, if you look at the names, last names that end in son, which is Eriksson, Johnson, Adamson, Evanson, so on and so forth. These are they concentrate these son-ending last names, like Johnson. They show up in those areas where the Vikings landed, in northern parts of England, more northern parts. And then in the southern parts, you don't see so many last names that end in son. Of course, meaning son of like Johnson, John's son. And so they had a huge influence, and because they came and went, and a lot of them stayed, and then you had also kings that were shared between Denmark and England, and so there was really a lot of interchange, intermarriage between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. And then you have bilingual households, like, if you have a bilingual household today, you use both of the languages there, and something happens to the language. And if you watch that video that I posted, the mother tongue, it points out really well there at the cusp, at the borderline between Old English and Middle English. What started to happen, there's that little scene where they have a scenario, an acted up scenario, where an Anglo-Saxon and Norse person, they are buying and selling a horse. And they talk about the horse, and one speaks in Norse and the other one speaks in Anglo-Saxon, and they can communicate, but some of the word endings are different. Vocabulary, a lot of the vocabulary is actually shared, but what they decided to do unconsciously, but to aid communication, leave out the endings, and it's easier to communicate, because if you try to speak another language that uses a lot of inflectional endings, like Spanish, we talked about this already. It's the endings, the inflections that give us the headache. What kind of an inflection am I supposed to put at the end of this particular verb, and or this particular noun, and not so much nouns, but verbs, especially in Spanish. So that's where the kind of like communication problems come from. And then if both languages, if you're just in that language that is adopting the words, if it just leaves out the words of its own language, then we have this simplification process or reduction of cases and other inflectional endings, what happened between Old English and Middle English, and that's the big picture. So, so the Vikings had a huge influence, and the influence, we know that it must have been large, because, as we've mentioned before, they, them, and their pronouns were even borrowed from Norse, from Scandinavia. But these are like ethnically very closely related. Now, your book doesn't really focus on this, but when William the Conqueror came, it does a really good job in explaining the kind of like chaotic thing that was going on when right before William conquered the island, because there was an Anglo-Saxon king, there was someone who was a Scandinavian, a Norse claimant to the throne, and then there was William. So who is gonna get that? And so there was fighting, and William won. And you can read about those historical details in the book. It's quite fascinating. So the Viking contestant came first, and the Anglo-Saxon king marched his troops up there to fight him and won him, and then had to march his troops down south because William was coming, and then the troops were tired, and they lost. So they lost the whole country in 1066. So basically, let's look at the Middle English period, and I'll just leave that map up there. And we can conceptually divide the Middle English. Okay, Middle Earth, whatever. So we have Middle English from 1100 to 1500, and we can divide this period into 3 sub-periods. And this is just a quick overview. So the first one is from 1066, from the Norman Conquest. Oh, back up a little bit. What I wanted to say about the Normans is that they ethnically were also Germanic, because they were the descendants of the Vikings. Because the Vikings went everywhere. They came to England. They went all the way to Constantinople. They went to North America, so to Iceland. So they were all over the the world, one would say, could say. And they also went to France, and they did the same thing in France as they did when they went to England. So they also got a deal with the French king at that point, or one of them, and they were settling in what is now Normandy. It's not far away from England. You know, you just cross the pond. There's a you know, you can cross it by a short trip under the water. It doesn't take long. But of course, in that time, the people were in different kinds of vehicles. But they were descendants of Vikings as well. The Normans, that's why they called Normans Northmen. And so there was the Rollo the Dane, who was an ancestor of William the Conqueror, William the First, William Bastard, whatever you want to call him, and so they were ethnically also Germanic Vikings, but they had adopted the French language, so what they were speaking, they brought French there. However, it was the Norman variety of French, it wasn't the Parisian French. You've got a cute poem from Chaucer from the 14th century showing that there were differences. It was not like appreciated globally, that particular variety of that particular dialect that the Normans brought. So we'll talk a little bit more how that figured into the survival of English. So basically, this is the first sub-period of Middle English from the Norman Conquest 1066 to 1204. And this was a significant year, 1204. Your book mentions John Lackland. He was the King John of England. John Lackland, an interesting name for this particular king, because he lost all of Norman. He was called Lackland even before he lost those parts. So he lost all of Normandy except for the Channel Islands in 1204. So, if we rewind back to 1066, the Norman Conquest, it was an invasion, and it set the English language into a decline socially in England. It was the French conquest of England, even though it was the last of the great Germanic invasions of England. So it was politically and linguistically and ethnically a conquest of England. So they brought the French language there. The Duke of Normandy, William I, William the Conqueror, was the descendant of Rollo the Dane, a Viking who had been harassing the French areas there. The French King Charles the Simple, they all have lovely names. Charles the Simple, in 911, he did what King Alfred had done with the Danes in England. So King Alfred designated this one area as Danelaw, where the Vikings, the Scandinavians, where they can use their own laws, and in exchange of please leave us alone. So that worked, and it also worked in France. So northern France, Normandy, that's where William and his men came. So the Normans were French speakers, and in their dialect they had some traces of the Scandinavian accent and influence there. So that's why it was a little bit different, but it was French. Interestingly, when William the Conqueror came in 1066, won the Battle of Hastings, and won the throne. In 10 years after 1066, all of England was under William's control. And he had killed the Anglo-Saxon nobility, and it was just kind of, amazing. In 10 years there was this overturn of language, overturn of power, and interestingly, William was accepted, even though he killed a lot of people, and he was accepted because he brought some kind of unity and peace and stability to the country. And Vikings ceased to attack. When they won over England, the Vikings just then decided to left England alone, and that kind of marks the end of the Viking era in general. So the Welsh were also under his control. And Englishmen were replaced by Frenchmen everywhere. What mattered, so like in the state government jobs and church and culturally high culture places, they were taken up by the Frenchmen. And what happened also was that William brought the feudal system from France. He brought the feudal system into England, and that meant that people became kind of tied into the land. There was not, people didn't move as they normal people didn't move as much as people move nowadays, but they became really tied to the land, and they were serving their superiors and working for their superiors and so on. So this has an interesting consequence from the language point of view. The dialectal differences, they kind of proliferated. When people don't move freely and when they don't interact with each other, they don't bring the other dialect influences, and then the dialectal differences, they tend to kind of, so in this village you speak this way, and the village 20 miles away, people speak a little bit differently. Kings, during, this lasted about 300 years, the French rule in England. Kings spoke no English. However, the majority of the people, they spoke English. English just didn't have any prestige. It was the language of the peasants. Latin was used in church, Scandinavian in Danelaw, and Celtic languages were spoken in the Celtic areas in Wales specifically, and Scotland. And why English was able to survive is due to several factors, and one of them is the nurses, the women who took care of the nobility's children, French-speaking nobility's children. They had English-speaking nurses, and they were exposed to English all the time. English was the language of the majority, even though French was the power language. The second period then would be, so 1204 is the time when John Lackland lost those French areas. So it marked an interesting time politically, because during this period, people were they owned land both in England and in France, and they went back and forth. And that brought the constant new French influence when new French people kept coming to England to visit relatives and so on. And both French was used because of this back and forth. in 1204, the significant losses of French lands meant that people had to choose whether they're going to live in England or live in France. And that kind of put an end to the new French blood coming in to England. So 1204 and then to 1348 is the second period. So this period we can say that this is English in decline. And here English in the ascendant. English is starting to gain ground. Remember, this is the language of the majority. So there was this connection between England and France was cut in 1204. Also, it lasted. It was cut then more later on, and that led to some kind of a lack of interest to learn French, to use French, and Anglo-French, the French used in England by the Frenchmen, the Normans, Norman French, it was ridiculed by people because it wasn't Parisian. So in 1348 something horrible happened, and that started the last sub-period, which we can call English triumphant. What was that horrible thing that happened in 1348?
The plague.
The plague. Yes. So we here with our face shields and face masks are not the first wave of people who have to battle a plague. So and this was I was reading reading in your text that, and then the plague, reviewing this stuff, the plague came back, and then it came back again and again and again and again. So I'm like, okay, several different waves of it. So it kind of puts these things, what we're going through, into perspective in a way. It was horrible when you got the plague. Every third person died in England and in Europe. Every third person died of it. So that was the Black Death. A form of bubonic plague, and 1/3 of the people died. So it lasted like till 1351, but then it kept coming back. So this Black Death, what does that have to do with language? It has a lot to do with language because it killed people, every third person, regardless of whether they were French speakers or English speakers. And that plague left the majority population, the English speakers, into a more powerful position in the sense because workforce became a problem. Who's going to be working on the fields? Who's going to be doing the cleaning, the cooking, the chores that need to be done, because nobility, the French nobility, they were not able to do it or willing to do it or what have you. But this meant that there were fewer French people left, and in relation, comparatively, more of the English people left, and their value kind of like went up because they could do those chores that the French nobility couldn't do, French-speaking nobility couldn't do. And it's interesting that, together with the appreciation of what people can do, their language also gains more prestige. So that was one of the factors. The second factor was the 100 Years' War, which was between England and France. And it lasted not 100 years, but a little bit more, from 1337 to 1453. And because it was between England and France, then the French language kind of like kept losing its, in a way, prestige, or people didn't even want to use French because it was a language of the enemy. Interesting phenomenon. So different kinds of things happened in the society. These are external influences to language change. And in this case, it was a shift of the societal power language, a gradual shift from French toward English. French left a huge influence, about 10,000 loan words, and you have some examples in your book. So what happened in 1509, Henry VIII came to the throne, and that brought in a completely different dynamic in England, and because he brought the Reformation, so that he could divorce his first wife. So, I think that's it. I was going to talk to you about the phonemization of the Voicedfricatives to kind of like get started with, if you want to, I'm going to post this. So this was one of the significant differences. Your book lists a lot of differences, and I notice you've been reading it and you've been picking them up. I'll just go over this really quickly in a minute. So phonemization of voiced fricatives. Old English had these voiced fricatives, s, and okay, and then it had each had two allophones. And s, and z, and th. So a voiced and voiceless allophone. You remember the voiced allophones were used when there were voiced sounds on both sides of that F or S or F. Okay, so they became a voicing assimilation. In Middle English, these took over a phonemic status. They gained a phonemic status. So and were both now in Middle English independent phonemes. S and z were independent phonemes, and were independent phonemes. So what was added was this and this and this into the phoneme inventory. They had appeared as allophones earlier, okay? And that's the point. The voiced fricatives, they gain phoneme status. I'm going to post the next homework assignment by Friday, and that'll be about this. That's why I wanted to kind of like pull this up and keep you over for a minute. But thank you for your patience.